In the autumn of 1884, on the muddy north bank of the Snake River, where it widened below the town of Brant's Ferry in the Idaho Territory, a young woman stood ankle-deep in cold silt and looked at a thing the whole town had agreed was worthless. It was a dock, or what had once been a dock, a long timber landing that had served the river trade before the railroad came up from the south and took the freight away. Now it sagged into the water like the spine of some drowned animal, its planks black with rot, its pilings furred green with river weed. She had paid $2 for it that morning, 2 silver dollars laid flat on the auctioneer's table, and the men gathered in the cold had laughed at her until their laughter ran out of breath. Her name was Hannah Crow, and she was 18 years old, and she was alone in a way that few people are ever alone. Her father had been dead 4 months. Her mother had been dead 9 years. The small house they had rented at the edge of town belonged now to the man who had held the note on it, and that man had told her, not unkindly but without softness either, that she had until the first frost to find somewhere else to be. She had a canvas bag of clothes, a folding knife, a tin of her father's tools, and $4 to her name when the morning began. By noon she had 2, and a rotted dock nobody else would touch. What the men at the auction did not know, what they could not have known, was that the rotted dock was about to give Hannah Crow back everything the world had taken from her, and a good deal more besides. That, though, is the end of the story, and the story does not begin at its end. It begins with a girl, a river, and a habit of looking at things other people had stopped looking at. Stay with that habit. It is the whole of what saved her. Hannah's father had been a dock builder and a boat carpenter, a man named Eli Crow, who had come west from the Ohio country with a chest of chisels and a way of speaking to wood that Hannah had spent her childhood watching. He was not a talkative man. He taught the way the river taught, by current and by patience, by showing a thing once and expecting it to be remembered. When Hannah was small, he had set her on an overturned bucket beside his bench, and let her watch him fit a joint, and when she reached for a tool, he did not slap her hand away. He gave it to her. He said that a person who feared a tool would never learn a craft, and a person who learned a craft would never go hungry. And he had been wrong about the second part, because he or she stood hungry, but right about the first. He had built things along that river for 20 years. Landings and skiffs, and the long, flat-bottomed scows that carried ore down to the rail spur, and once, when Hannah was perhaps 10, a strange commission that he had never fully explained. A man had come to him in the winter, a heavy-set man in a good coat who spoke softly and paid in gold, and Eli had built for him something below a dock, a chamber set into the pilings where the water would hide it, sealed against the wet with pitch and lead, and a craft Eli had learned from a Dutch shipwright in his youth. Hannah remembered the work because her father had let her hand him the oakum, the loose hard fiber that caulkers drove into seams, and she remembered that he had been quiet afterward in a way that was not his usual quiet. He had washed the gold in the river before he brought it home, as if to take the man's hand off it. She had not thought of that commission in years. She thought of it now because the dock she had bought for $2 was the same dock, and the heavy-set man in the good coat was 9 years dead, and the chamber her father had built below the water line had never to her knowledge been opened. You may wonder why a girl with $4 would spend half of it on rotted timber. Sit with that question a moment, because the answer is the kind of thing the world forgets to value. She bought it because she had watched her father build into it, and because a thing built with that much care is rarely built to hold nothing. The auction had been held on the porch of the Territorial Land Office, where the property of men who died owing money was sold off to settle their debts. The heavy-set man, whose name had been Gideon Pratt, had died owing a great deal, and his holdings had been picked over for years, the good ones first, the worthless ones last, until all that remained was a river frontage with a collapsing dock that no steamboat could safely tie to and no railroad cared about. The auctioneer, A thin man named Doyle, with a voice worn flat by 100 such mornings, had read the parcel out as a formality. He had expected no bids. When Hannah raised her hand, he had squinted at her as if she were a trick of the light. $2, she had said. Her voice did not shake. Doyle had looked at the men around him, and the men had looked at her patched dress and her canvas bag, and one of them, a freighter named Bull Maddox, with a laugh like a dropped barrel, had said that the girl had just bought herself a place to drown. The others took it up. Doyle let them have their moment, because a flat morning needs its small entertainments, and then he brought down his hand and said "sold" to the young lady, for $2, and may God help her get any use of it. Hannah had laid her coins on the table and signed the paper in her father's careful hand, which he had taught her, and walked down to the river to look at what was hers. She stood there a long while. The cold came up through her boots, and she did not move. She was reading the dock the way her father had taught her to read wood, not with the eyes only, but with the whole attention, looking for the places where the work was honest and the places where the water had won. Most of it was lost. The decking would have to come up entire. The pilings, though, the great squared timbers driven into the riverbed, those her father had set deep and true, and between the third and fourth piling from the shore, the water moved wrong. It eddied where it should have run smooth, curling around something that did not belong to the natural shape of the bank. She marked the place in her mind, and she went to find a shovel. That first afternoon she did little but clear. She climbed the bank to the boarding house on the rise above, the landing a long, low building of whitewashed boards, gone gray on the weather side, and she knocked at the kitchen door because she did not have the price of the front. A widow named Mrs. Tilford answered, a broad woman, with flour to the elbows and a face that had buried 2 husbands and a son, and learned from each of them. She had known Eli Crow. She had bought her firewood off him and her coffin boards, too, when the time came, and she looked at Eli's daughter standing in the cold with a borrowed errand in her eyes and read the whole of the situation before Hannah said a word. She asked what the girl needed. Hannah said a spade, if one could be spared, and that she would bring it back. Mrs. Tilford fetched a spade from the lean-to, and a heel of brown bread wrapped in a cloth, and she pressed the bread into Hannah's hands and said nothing about it, because there is a kindness that announces itself, and a kindness that does not, and the second kind is worth more. Hannah thanked her and meant it. Then she went back down to the river and began to dig. The silt around the pilings was the color of iron, and it smelled of rot, a black river mud built up over years where the current slacked behind the dock and dropped what it carried. She dug in the shallows with the cold water rising past her boots and numbing her to the knee, and she learned in the first hour that a spade is a poor tool against silt under water, that the mud closed behind the blade as fast as she could lift it, that the river was patient and would undo a day's work in a night if she let it. She did not let it. She worked a system, casting the mud well up the bank, where the current could not reclaim it, working from the shore side outward so the cleared ground stayed cleared, and she kept at it, lifting and casting and lifting again, until the early dark came down off the pine slopes, and the cold had gone from her knees up into her hips, and she could no longer feel the spade in her hands. She slept that night in the dock-keeper's shed at the top of the bank, a windowless box of gray boards that came with the parcel, and that no one had thought worth mentioning. She had a horse blanket and her canvas bag for a pillow and the sound of the river all night long. She was cold and she was hungry and she was not afraid. Fear, her father had told her once, is mostly the body asking a question the mind already knows the answer to. Her mind knew the answer. The answer was to keep digging. By the second day, the town had decided she was a curiosity. Men came down to the bank to watch the orphan girl labor in the river mud, and some of them offered advice that was really mockery, and a few offered help that was really an angling after whatever fool notion she was chasing. She thanked them all the same way, evenly, and took none of it. Bull Maddox came and stood with his thumbs in his belt and asked her what she expected to find. Gold doubloons, a pirate's chest, and laughed before she could answer. She did not answer. She had learned from her father that a question asked to mock does not deserve a reply, and that the best answer to a man like Maddox is the steady sound of work continuing. What she was finding, slowly, was the shape of her father's secret. As the silt came away, she uncovered, between the third and fourth pilings, a band of timber that did not match the rest, newer wood, or wood that had been newer once, fitted between the great squared posts with a tightness that the river had not been able to pry apart in 9 years. It was the face of the chamber. She knew it the way you know a face you have not seen since childhood, by something under the surface that memory holds on to when the details have gone. Here the work changed from clearing to opening, and the opening was the hard part, and the hard part took 11 days. She could not simply break it. Whatever her father had sealed below the waterline, he had sealed to keep the river out, and the river, given any opening, would pour in and ruin whatever the chamber held before she ever saw it. She had to open it the way it had been, closed, dry, and careful, and from above. So she built, first, a cofferdam, a thing she had watched her father build a dozen times, a ring of driven planks packed with clay to hold back the water while a man worked below the river's surface. She had no men. She had herself, a borrowed spade, her father's tin of tools, and a stubbornness that the town mistook for madness. She drove the planks at low water, in the gray hour before dawn, when the river ran lowest, hammering them down into the bed with a wooden maul. She made herself from a fallen cottonwood limb, because a metal hammer would have split the soft plank tops and an iron strike would have carried the sound across the water to men who were already too curious. She had cut the planks from the soundest of the old decking, sawing them to a point at one end so they would bite the riverbed, and she set them in a ring around the place where the water eddied, overlapping each plank against the last the way her father had shown her, so the ring would shed water inward rather than let it seep between. 3 planks the first morning, 5 the next. Her shoulders learned a kind of pain that did not go away between sleeps but only changed its place, and her hands blistered, and the blisters broke, and the broken skin hardened, and she kept driving planks. She packed the clay with her bare hands, digging it from a seam in the bank, a quarter-mile up where the spring floods had cut down to good blue clay, carrying it back in a grain sack and working it into the gaps between the planks, kneeling in water that stopped her breath, smoothing it and pressing it, and feeling for the cold thread of a leak, with fingers gone past feeling. When the ring was closed, she began to bale, and bailing a cofferdam by hand with a single bucket is the kind of labor that does not end. It only pauses while you sleep and resumes the moment you wake. The first ring failed. She had set the planks too shallow on the riverside, and on the third night the current found the weakness and worked behind them, and the whole upstream face bellied in and filled. And she came down at dawn to find a week of work standing full of brown water with the river running through it, as if she had never been there at all. She stood and looked at it a long while in the cold. Then she pulled the failed planks, one by one, and she drove them again, deeper this time, a full hand's breadth deeper into the bed, and she did not curse the river or herself, because her father had taught her that the river is not your enemy. The river is only the river, and a man who blames the water for his own shallow planks will drown blaming it. She built the ring a second time. The second ring held. On the 5th day of the opening, a man came down to the bank who was not there to mock. He was old past 70, with a white beard stained yellow at the chin and a way of standing that favored one hip, and he watched her bail for a long while before he spoke. His name was Amos Farrell, and he had been a ferryman on that stretch of river for 40 years, and he had known Eli Crow well. He told her that her father had been the best hand with wet timber he had ever seen, and that he himself had been the one to row Gideon Pratt out to the dock the winter the chamber was built, and that he had always wondered what became of it. Hannah stopped bailing and looked at him. She asked him what he remembered. He remembered that Pratt had come to the territory with money no one could account for, and had bought up river frontage and a freight company and a half-interest in the bank, and that men who crossed him in business had a way of finding their claims tied up in paperwork until they sold cheap or gave up entirely. He remembered a family named Sorrel, a man and his wife and a grown daughter, who had owned a good landing upriver and a contract to carry ore, and who had lost both to Pratt in a tangle of liens and notes that no one in the territory had ever quite understood. Because the Sorrels had been careful people, and careful people do not lose everything to a clean accounting. He remembered that the Sorrel man had died of a fever the following spring, and that his widow and daughter had gone east with nothing, and that no one had spoken the name Sorrel in Brant's Ferry in years. Hannah wrote the name in her memory beside the work. She did not yet know what it meant. She knew only that her father had built a sealed chamber for a man who took things from careful people, and that her father had washed the gold in the river before he carried it home, and that those two facts had a shape between them she could not yet see. Amos Farrell came back the next morning with a second bucket and a length of good rope, and he bailed with her, an old man and a girl, in a closed ring of planks below a rotting dock, while the town watched from the top of the bank and made its jokes. He did not bail fast. His back would not let him bend for long, so he rigged the rope over the dock's one sound crossbeam, and they hauled the full bucket up between them, hand over hand, and tipped it over the side, and lowered it down again. And in that way an old man who could not stoop and a girl who could not lift a full bucket clear of the ring became, together, prost a thing that could. They worked mostly in silence. Now and again he told her something about the river, where it ran deep and where it ran false, which she filed away. And now and again he told her something about her father and those she kept closer. He told her that Eli Crow had once spent a whole winter rebuilding a widow's skiff for nothing because the widow had no money and a child to feed across the water, and had never spoken of it, and that this was the measure of the man, that his best work was the work no one saw and no one paid for. Hannah bailed and listened and said little, because there was nothing to add to a true thing well said. He did not bail fast. He bailed steady, though, and steady is what wins against a river. The cofferdam held. By the 8th day of the opening, the water inside the ring stood low enough that the top of the chamber stood clear, a flat face of pitched timber, black with tar, and Hannah knelt in the mud at the bottom of her own small dry well and put her hands on the work her father had done 9 years before. The pitch had cracked in places, but it had held. She could see the seams where the oakum had been driven, the loose tarred fiber she had handed up to him as a child, and she could see that the whole face had been built to be opened by someone who understood how it had been closed, with a key that was not a key of metal but a key of knowledge. There was a batten across the top, a strip of wood pegged over the seam, and the pegs were tapered, and a person who did not know better would have tried to pull them and split the timber and let in the river. Hannah did not pull them. She drove them, tapping each peg from the wide end so that it backed out through the narrow, the way her father drew a peg he meant to use again, and the batten came free clean, and under it was the seam, and the seam was sealed with a bead of lead poured molten into a channel cut for it, a shipwright's trick from the old country. And the lead would have to be lifted. She had no proper tools for lead work. She had her father's chisels and a thin blade, and the patience the river had been teaching her for 2 weeks. She warmed the lead with a brand of burning pitch pine held close until it softened, and she lifted it in a single curling strip, careful as peeling skin from fruit, and she laid the strip aside on a clean board because lead, her father had taught her, is too dear to waste. Under the lead was the lid, and the lid, after 9 years sealed below a river, lifted under her hands with a long sigh of air that had been held since before she was old enough to remember the man who paid in gold. The air that came out of the chamber was cold, and it smelled of tar and old metal, and something dry. Underneath, paper, The particular dust of paper kept long in the dark. She did not reach in at once. She knelt there in the bottom of the cofferdam with the river pressing at the planks all around her and the lid in her two hands, and she let herself understand that whatever was in the chamber had been there since she was 9 years old, untouched, waiting, the way I held breath. Then she set the lid aside as carefully as she had set the lead, and she looked in. The chamber was the size of a steamer trunk, lined with sheet tin against the wet, and it was nearly full. There were canvas sacks, 4 of them, heavy and squat, and there was an iron strong-box the length of the man's forearm, and there was a packet wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with a cord, and laid across the top of everything as if it had been the last thing set in and the first meant to be found. There was a ledger bound in black leather. Hannah lifted the ledger first. She was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that you read a thing before you spend it. The light was failing, and she carried the ledger up the bank to the shed and read it by a tallow candle Mrs. Tilford had given her, and she read until the candle guttered. And then she sat in the dark and understood what she held. The ledger was Gideon Pratt's true account, the one he had kept behind the false one, and in it, in a small, precise hand, he had written down every theft he had, dressed as a transaction, the liens he had filed on claims that were paid in full, the notes he had forged the signatures upon, the men he had paid to swear to debts that did not exist. And against each entry he had written the sum he had taken and the name of the person he had taken it from, because a man like Pratt does not steal to have. He steals to know that he has won, and he could not enjoy the winning unless he kept the score. The name Sorrel was in the ledger 11 times. The canvas sacks held coin, gold and silver, the proceeds of the thefts that Pratt had not dared to bank where the amounts might be questioned. The iron strong-box held the original deeds and contracts, the real ones that Pratt had taken from his victims and replaced with forgeries, because the safest place for the evidence of a crime is in the hand of the man who profits by it, where no one would think to look and no one could compel him to produce it. And the packet in waxed cloth held letters, and the letters were the part that made Hannah Crow sit very still in the dark. They were her father's letters. Eli Crow had built the chamber, yes, and been paid in gold he washed in the river, but he had not built it in ignorance. He had understood, or come to understand, what manner of man Pratt was and what the chamber was for, and rather than refuse the work and be ruined as the Sorrels had been ruined, he had done the work, and then quietly, over the years, he had written down what he knew. He had made his own account, and he had sealed copies of it into the chamber alongside Pratt's, so that if the day ever came that the chamber was opened by honest hands, the truth would not depend on the word of a dead carpenter against a dead financier, but would stand in Pratt's own ledger, in Pratt's own hand, confirmed by the deeds and the letters all together. Her father had not been able to right the wrong in his lifetime. A poor man cannot accuse a rich one and be believed. He had been able, though, to build a box that the river would keep until the wrong could be righted, and he had trusted, perhaps, that the daughter he had taught to read would one day read this too. I told you to stay with her habit of looking at things others had stopped looking at. Here's what that habit was worth. Not the gold, though the gold was real. What it was worth was the truth, sealed in tin below a river, waiting for the one person who knew how it had been closed. Hannah did not sleep that night. She sat with the ledger and her father's letters, and she did the thing that her father had done, which was to read before she spent, to understand before she acted. By morning, she knew what she was going to do, and it was not what the gold alone might have tempted a poorer-hearted person to do. She could have taken the coin and gone. 4 sacks of gold and silver would have carried her east in comfort, set her up in any city she chose, made her, at 18 and alone, a woman of independent means. No one knew the chamber had been opened. No one would have come looking. The river had kept the secret 9 years and would have kept it forever. She did not take the coin and go. She took the ledger to the territorial land office, and she laid it on the same table where she had laid her 2 silver dollars, and she asked the clerk to send for the marshal and for the judge who rode the circuit, because what she had to show them concerned the law. The clerk did not want to send for anyone. A girl in a mud-stained dress with a black ledger is not, on the face of it, a matter for the law. Amos Farrell had come with her, though, and Amos was old and respected and stubborn, and he said that the judge would want to see what the girl had found, or would answer for not seeing it, and the weight of 40 years on the river is a weight a clerk learns not to argue with. The judge was sent for. He came in 3 days, a dry, careful man named Holloway, who had heard every kind of claim and believed almost none of them, and Hannah laid the matter before him the way her father laid a joint, one piece at a time, fitted true. She showed him Pratt's ledger, and she showed him the forged notes named in it, and she showed him the original deeds from the strong box that proved the notes were forgeries, and she showed him her father's letters that explained how the chamber had been built and why, and she did not raise her voice once, and she did not say a single word against any living man, because the dead financier needed no accusing. The ledger accused him. The deeds accused him. The lead-sealed truth her father had hidden below the river accused him in his own precise hand. Judge Holloway studied the ledger for the better part of a day. He was not a man given to display. When he had finished, he closed the book and set his hand flat on the cover, and he said quietly that in 30 years on the bench he had never seen a fraud so completely documented, and never by its own author. He asked Hannah what she wanted done. She said she wanted the property returned. To every person in the ledger, or to their heirs if the person was dead, she wanted the deeds returned and the false debts struck from the records, and whatever coin in the sacks could be matched to a theft restored to the one it was stolen from. She did not ask for the gold. She asked for the wrongs to be unwound, one entry at a time, in the order they had been written. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. He asked her if she understood that some of the coin could not be matched to any name, that the unclaimed portion would by rights come to her as the finder and the owner of the dock. She said she understood. He asked if she wished to claim it. She said she would claim what the law gave her after the wronged were made whole, and not $1 before, and that she would abide by his accounting of which was which. It took the better part of a year to unwind what Gideon Pratt had spent a decade building. Holloway appointed Amos Farrell and Mrs. Sadge, Tilford, and a banker from the territorial capital to sit as a commission, and they went through the ledger entry by entry, and they found the people named, or their children, or the towns they had scattered to, and one by one the deeds went back and the false debts were struck and the stolen coin was counted out and returned. Some of the names led nowhere to graves, with no headstones and families gone past finding. Most led somewhere. There was a Norwegian who had lost a timber claim and was found cutting another man's trees for wages 2 valleys over, and who wept when the deed was put in his hand and was not ashamed to weep. There was a freight contractor whose forged note had broken him, found keeping a livery in a town downriver, who would not believe it until the original contract was laid beside the forgery, and he saw with his own eyes that his signature had been traced. The widow Sorrell and her daughter were found in St. Louis, taking in sewing in 2 rented rooms above a tin shop, and the landing that Pratt had taken from them was restored to their name along with 11 years of the income it should have earned, paid out of the gold in the canvas sacks. The daughter, who had been a girl of Hannah's age when her family was ruined, wrote Hannah a letter that Hannah kept the rest of her life. She did not thank her for the money. She thanked her for the believing, she wrote, because for 11 years she had carried the knowledge that her father had been an honest man cheated, and had watched the world treat him as a fool who had failed, and the hardest part of all of it had not been the poverty but the not being believed. To have the truth come back out of a river after 11 years, she wrote, was like having her father's name washed clean while she watched. Hannah read the letter twice and folded it away, and she understood that the thing she had given back was not 11 years of income. It was the believing. The money was only the proof of it. The town that had laughed at her stopped laughing. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen with apologies, because frontier towns do not apologize any more than rivers do. It happened the way the thaw happens, quietly and from underneath. Bull Maddox, who had told her she had bought a place to drown, came down to the bank one day and stood a while and then offered, gruffly, to haul her rotted decking away for nothing, and she let him because a man who has been wrong is best allowed to be useful. Doyle, the auctioneer, took to nodding at her. In the street, Mrs. Pra, the Tilford, who had given her the spade and the bread and the candle, became something near to family, and Hannah boarded with her through that long year of accounting and never forgot a kindness given before there was any reason to expect a return. When the commission had finished its work, when the last deed had been returned and the last false debt struck, there remained in the canvas sacks a sum of gold and silver that belonged to no name in the ledger. The proceeds, Holloway judged, of thefts so old or so well buried that the wronged could not be found. By the law of the territory it came to Hannah Crow, finder and owner of the dock below which it had lain. It was not a fortune to make a person idle. It was enough, though, she did not go east. She had thought she might, in the cold first nights in the shed, but the river had become hers by then in a way she had not chosen and could not undo. She used the money to do the only thing she had ever truly known how to do, which was to build. She rebuilt the dock properly this time, with sound timber and honest joints, and she built it not as a private landing, but as a public one, a place where the small farmers and freighters who could not afford the rail spur could load their goods cheap and fair. She hired Amos Farrell to run the ferry off the end of it until he was too old, and after that she ran it herself, and after that she hired others, and the landing at Brant's Ferry became, in the years that followed, a thing the town was known for. The place where a person who had been treated unfairly by the big concerns could get a square deal from the woman who owned the dock. She married in time a quiet man who mended nets and asked nothing of her but to be allowed to work beside her, and they had children, and the children grew up the way she had grown up, sat on an overturned bucket beside a workbench and handed tools instead of having their hands slapped away. She told them about their grandfather, the dock builder, who had built a box. The river could not open until the right hands came, and she told them that the most valuable thing a person can own is the patience to look closely at what everyone else has agreed to ignore. She did not tell them this as a lesson. She told it as a story, which is the only way a true thing ever stays remembered. The ledger she gave to Judge Holloway for the territorial records, and the deeds went back to their owners, and the gold went where gold goes, into ground and timber and the slow making of a life. One thing she kept, though. From the chamber below the dock, among her father's sealed letters, she had taken a single tool, a caulking iron with a worn oak handle, the very one he had used to drive the oakum into the seams the winter she was 9 years old, sealed away with his account as if he had known it would mean more to her than the gold. She kept it on a peg by the door of the house she built above the river. She touched it sometimes when she passed, the way a person touches a thing that has carried them across a hard water, and she did not need to explain to anyone why. Years later, when she was an old woman and the dock had been rebuilt twice more, and the town had long since forgotten it had ever laughed, a young man from a newspaper in Boise came to ask her about the famous orphan who had found a fortune under a rotted dock, and he wanted to know, he said, what it had felt like to be rich. She looked at him a while, the way she had once looked at a sagging dock that everyone else had written off, reading him for the honest grain under the question. Then she told him he had the story wrong. She had not found a fortune, she said. She had found the truth, and given most of it back and kept only what was hers. And the difference between those two things was the whole of what her father had tried to teach her. The young man wrote it down, but she could see he did not understand it, not yet, being young, She did not mind. Some things are like lead poured into a seam. They have to be lifted slowly, by the right hands, when the time has come, and not before. She walked him to the door when he had finished, and as he went she rested her hand for a moment on the worn oak handle of the caulking iron on its peg, the river bright below the window in the late sun, and she thought, as she often thought, of a man washing gold in cold water to take another man's hand off it, and of a box built to be opened by knowledge alone, and of $2 laid flat on a table while grown men laughed. The river ran on below the house the way it had run on below the dock the morning she bought it, patient and unhurried, carrying everything and keeping what mattered, and Hannah Crow stood in her own doorway in her own house on her own ground and was content. If you have ever been the one everyone in the room was laughing at, the one they were sure had thrown her last dollars away, I would like to know what you saw, that they did not, the thing under the surface that you could not let go of. And if a story like this one stayed with you, of a thing the world threw away, that held the proof, to set a great wrong right, there are others, and they are waiting, sealed and patient for the hands that know how to open them.